The emergency sirens wailed through the station's med bay, a shrill, urgent cry that sent every doctor scrambling, every doctor except the ones who actually mattered. "I'm sorry, but this creature does not fall under our jurisdiction," the lead xenomedical specialist declared, his voice flat, unbothered. He barely glanced at the massive, broken form sprawled across the floor. "It is not recognized as a sentient species by galactic medical standards." The air in the room was sterile, too clean, too indifferent. The other doctors, a mix of species from across the cosmos, exchanged silent glances before stepping back. It was a quiet refusal, one that spoke louder than words. On the floor, struggling for breath, lay something incredible, something terrifying. A cybernetic wolf, at least 10 feet long from snout to tail, its body a fusion of organic muscle and gleaming alloy. Deep gashes marred its synthetic hide, leaking a strange mixture of blue biogel and dark blood. A jagged wound along its flank revealed tangled circuitry beneath, flickering erratically like a failing heartbeat. It was alive, and it was dying. The creature let out a guttural, pained sound, a sound that should have been a growl but came out distorted, broken. Its glowing yellow eyes, once fierce, were dimming. No one moved. No one cared. "Get it out of here," someone muttered. That was the final straw. A voice cut through the cold silence, sharp with disbelief and anger. "Are you serious?" The room turned toward the one person who hadn't stepped back. A human. He wasn't dressed in the crisp uniforms of the med bay staff. His clothes were simpler, slightly worn, with the telltale stains of someone who worked with their hands. He didn't smell like antiseptic and regulation. He smelled like earth, hay, and something faintly metallic. A veterinarian. The alien doctor scoffed. One of them even laughed. "You're a farmhand. You fix livestock. This is beyond you." The human ignored them, dropping to one knee beside the fallen creature. His hands moved instinctively, assessing the damage, feeling for life. The cyber wolf shuddered beneath his touch, its body twitching. It was in agony, but it hadn't given up yet. Neither would he. "Just because it's not on your little list doesn't mean it's not worth saving," he said, voice firm. The doctors exchanged looks, annoyance, mild curiosity, but mostly indifference. It wasn't their problem. "Fine," the xenomedical specialist said with a dismissive wave. "It's your problem now." The others turned away, already moving on to cases that fit neatly within their guidelines. The human exhaled, barely believing what had just happened. No protocol. No concern. They had just left this thing to die. His gaze flicked back to the cyber wolf. Its eyes were barely open now, its breathing ragged. "Hey," he murmured, gently tapping the side of its head. "Stay with me." The wolf's ear twitched. That was enough. Gritting his teeth, the human pulled out a med scanner from his pack. Not standard issue, not high-tech, just something he'd cobbled together over the years to tend to wounded farm beasts. Would have to do. The screen blinked to life, scrolling through information in unfamiliar patterns. Alien biology mixed with synthetic components. No guidebooks, no references, just raw, messy life in front of him. He swallowed hard. This wasn't a cow with a broken leg. This wasn't a workhorse with a fever. This was something new. Something lethal. And he was its only chance. The cyber wolf's body convulsed beneath his hands, a jarring reminder that time was running out. The human tightened his grip on the scanner, forcing himself to focus. He could figure this out. He had to. The screen flickered wildly, struggling to make sense of the mixture of organic and synthetic components. It wasn't built for this. He wasn't built for this. But none of that mattered. His fingers moved on instinct, feeling for anything familiar, breath, pulse, something. Beneath the cold metal plating there was warmth. Beneath the tangled circuits, a heartbeat. Weak. Erratic. But there. A surge of determination pushed through his chest. This wasn't just a machine. This wasn't just an animal. It was something in between, something that had fought to get here, that had clawed its way through God's knew what just to end up abandoned on this floor. He wasn't about to let it die. The human shifted, pulling a small case from his pack. It wasn't much. Just a portable medkit with a handful of supplies. But it would have to do. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before pulling out a vial of coagulant, normally used for livestock with deep wounds. Would it work on something part metal, part flesh? There wasn't time to second guess. He grabbed a sterilized injector, filled it, and pressed it against the cyber wolf's side. For a moment nothing happened. Then the creature let out a sharp, mechanical whine, its whole body twitching as the fluid worked its way through its system. Its limbs tensed, claws scraping weakly against the floor. The human pressed a steadying hand against its neck. "Easy," he murmured. Just hold on. The wolf's glowing yellow eyes flickered open for a heartbeat. They locked onto him, sharp, intelligent. He froze. This thing understood him. Not just on some basic, instinctual level. There was something behind those eyes, something thinking, something aware. Then the moment passed. The creature slumped again, its energy spent. But it was still breathing. That was enough. For now. A shadow fell over him. He didn't need to look up to know one of the doctors was still watching. He could feel the weight of their gaze, the silent judgment. What exactly do you think you're doing? The human exhaled slowly, forcing down the frustration tightening in his chest. Saving a life. It isn't your responsibility. He finally looked up, meeting the alien's gaze. They were tall, unnaturally thin, with skin a shade of deep violet. Their expression was unreadable, but their tone carried the same detached indifference the others had. If it were a human lying here, would you say the same thing? The doctor's expression didn't change. That is irrelevant. The human's jaw clenched. He turned back to the cyber wolf, ignoring them. Another sharp breath rattled through the creature's form, but it was a little stronger this time. The coagulant was working at least for now. But that wasn't enough. It needed more. It needed real treatment. And it wasn't going to get it here. The human glanced around. The other doctors had already moved on, their attention fixed on cases that were actually within their guidelines. The few remaining staff barely spared him a glance. Good. He didn't wait. He reached down, gripping the cyber wolf beneath its front legs and started to lift. The thing was heavier than he expected. A lot heavier. He gritted his teeth, adjusting his stance, and hauled it up as best he could. The cyber wolf let out a weak noise, but it didn't struggle. It didn't have the strength to. One step. Then another. Stop, the doctor said. You didn't? You are making a mistake. He kept walking. By the time he reached the doors, his arms were burning, his breath coming fast. The cyber wolf was dead weight in his grasp, but he didn't let go. The doors slid open with a soft hiss. And then he was out. The station's corridors stretched ahead, sterile and metallic, dimly lit by the glow of overhead lights. He kept moving, heart pounding. No one stopped him. No one even looked at him. They didn't care. Fine. He had his own plan. The vet clinic was on the lower levels of the station, tucked away where the more important medical facilities didn't bother to look. It wasn't much, just a cramped space lined with old equipment, built more for treating work animals than anything like this. But it was something. He staggered inside, lowering the cyber wolf onto the padded table as gently as he could. The thing barely stirred. He was running out of time. His hands moved quickly, grabbing supplies, setting up scanners, trying to piece together some kind of treatment plan on the fly. The readings were a mess of conflicting data. The wolf's body was shutting down, its systems failing one by one. His stomach twisted. There was no guidebook for this. No textbook to tell him what to do next. Just his instincts. He let out a slow breath, pushing everything else aside. He could do this. He had to. And then, just as he reached for the next tool, the cyber wolf's eyes snapped open. And it spoke. The cyber wolf's glowing yellow eyes locked onto him, sharp and calculating, no longer dulled by pain or weakness. The human froze, his breath catching in his throat. Then, in a voice that was more static than sound, the creature spoke. Where am I? The words came out distorted, broken, like an old radio struggling to hold a signal. But there was no mistaking the intent. It wasn't just noise. It was language. It understood him. Shock jolted through his system, but there was no time to process it. The cyber wolf's body jerked, another shuddering tremor racking through its frame. The injuries were still bad. Too bad. The human's hands moved instinctively, pressing down on a fresh wound to slow the bleeding. You're safe, he said quickly, his voice firm but calm. But you need to stay still. You're in bad shape. The cyber wolf let out a low, electronic whine, its body twitching again. Sparks flickered from one of the deeper gashes along its flank. Beneath the torn plating, delicate circuits pulsed in erratic patterns. It wasn't just hurt. It was shutting down. The human gritted his teeth, forcing his mind to work past the adrenaline and exhaustion. He had dealt with injured creatures before, terrified, hurting, lashing out. The most important thing was to keep them calm. Keep them focused. He grabbed a damp cloth and pressed it against the side of the wolf's head, a grounding touch. Hey, listen to me. The wolf's eyes flickered. You're not dying tonight. Got it? For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the tension in the cyber wolf's body eased just a fraction. Its breathing, though still rough, evened out. Good. The human exhaled sharply and turned back to the mess of wires and wounds. He had stabilized it for now, but that wouldn't last long. He needed to do more. His fingers worked quickly, grabbing a small tool from his kit and carefully adjusting a few exposed components. The wolf flinched slightly but didn't pull away. Its eyes remained locked on him, watching, assessing. "You're not one of them." The voice came again, still glitching, still fragmented. But there was something behind it now, something sharp, something wary. The human didn't look up. "One of who?" Pause. The ones who made me." His hands hesitated for the briefest second before continuing. He didn't know what he had expected. Maybe that this thing was some kind of military experiment. A rogue AI. A lost machine. But something about the way it spoke, the way it carried itself. This wasn't just a machine with programming. This was someone. The human's throat tightened, but he pushed it aside. No time for questions. Not yet. He grabbed a stabilizer pack and pressed it against the wolf's shoulder. A faint hum filled the air as the device activated, sending controlled pulses through its system to help regulate its failing circuits. The wolf sucked in a sharp breath, its claws scraping against the table. Its head turned slightly, its ears flicking toward the door. The human frowned. "What is it?" The wolf didn't answer. But he saw it then, just for a split second. A flicker of motion through the clinic's small window. A shadow shifting in the dim corridor beyond. His stomach dropped. Someone was watching. The human didn't move. Didn't breathe. He kept his hands steady on the cyber wolf, pretending he hadn't noticed. "Can you stand?" he murmured under his breath. The wolf let out a low, electronic growl, its body tensing. "Not yet." "Not good." The human forced himself to stay calm. He reached for a nearby scanner, pretending to check the wolf's vitals, while his other hand crept toward the old wrench he kept by the supply shelf. Then, the door handle twitched. A split second of silence. Then the door slammed open. Cold, sterile light flooded the room as figures moved in, a mix of humanoid and mechanical, their weapons glinting under the flickering ceiling lights. The humans' blood ran cold. They weren't station security. Their armor was too advanced, their movements too precise. And their eyes, bright, unblinking, inhuman, locked onto the cyber wolf with eerie determination. They were here for it. The wolf let out a guttural snarl, struggling to move, but its body was still too weak. The human's grip tightened around the wrench. He had no idea who these people were, but one thing was certain. They weren't here to help. The human's grip tightened around the wrench, his heart pounding in his ears. The figures that had just stormed into the clinic moved with eerie precision, their weapons steady, their glowing eyes locked onto the cyber wolf. There was no hesitation in their movements. Whoever they were, they had done this before. The cyber wolf let out a low, warning growl, but it was still too weak to move. Its body trembled with effort, its circuits flickering, but it wouldn't last long against them. One of the intruders stepped forward, their voice sharp and metallic. "Step away." The human didn't move. He kept his stance casual, forcing himself to breathe, to think. They hadn't shot him yet. That meant something. He glanced at their armor, sleek, reinforced plating, a mix of matte black and dull silver. No insignias. No station security tags. No identifying markers at all. That sent a chill down his spine. Mercenaries. Or worse. His mind raced. If they had been sent here, that meant someone knew the cyber wolf was still alive. And whoever that was, they didn't want it treated. They wanted it taken. Or destroyed. The lead soldier took another step forward. "I said step away. Now." The human clenched his jaw, glancing at the cyber wolf. Its yellow eyes burned with something dangerous, but there was also something else there. Something like recognition. He knew them. The realization made his stomach twist. These weren't just random hunters. They were connected to whatever had happened to the cyber wolf before it ended up bleeding out in the med bay. The human tightened his grip on the wrench, barely shifting his stance. "Not gonna happen," he said. The soldier exhaled sharply, a distorted, static-laced sound. "This doesn't concern you." The human's fingers flexed around the cold metal of the tool. "See, that's where you're wrong. The second you left it to die, it became my problem." A flicker of movement. The soldier's weapon twitched, shifting slightly in their grip. A warning. The cyber wolf tensed, its claws scraping weakly against the table. Its eyes darted between the soldiers, then back to the human. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. "Run." The word barely left the wolf's glitching voice box before all hell broke loose. The lead soldier moved first, raising his weapon, but the human was faster. He swung the wrench with everything he had, the heavy metal striking the soldier's forearm with a sickening crunch. The gun discharged, the shot going wide, searing into the clinic wall. The cyber wolf lunged, using what little strength it had left, snapping its powerful jaws around the nearest attacker's leg. Sparks flew as metal met metal, the soldier letting out a harsh, garbled curse. Chaos erupted. The human ducked as another shot rang out, barely missing his head. His mind screamed at him to run, to get out, but he couldn't leave the cyber wolf behind. It was fighting, but it was losing. His breath came fast, adrenaline surging. He grabbed a tray of tools and flung it toward the soldiers, buying himself a fraction of a second as they dodged the flying metal. Then he did the only thing he could think of. He grabbed the cyber wolf and ran. The wolf let out a pained snarl as he hauled it off the table, but it didn't fight him. It was barely holding on, its limbs limp, but it understood. It trusted him. Blaster fire tore through the air behind them, scorching the walls as the human shoved through the back door of the clinic. His boots hit the metal floor of the corridor, his muscles screaming under the weight of the wolf, but he didn't stop. They weren't safe. Not yet. He sprinted down the dimly lit passage, heart hammering, breath ragged. The cyber wolf let out a low, ragged noise, pain, exhaustion, maybe even frustration, but it didn't tell him to stop. Ahead, the corridor branched off into a maze of narrow maintenance tunnels. He could lose them in there. Maybe. If he was fast enough. Then, just as he turned the corner, just as he thought they might have a chance, the cyber wolf suddenly convulsed in his arms. Its entire body jerked violently, its systems flickering, its mechanical limbs twitching like something was tearing through them from the inside. The human nearly dropped it. Hey, stay with me. The wolf's yellow eyes snapped open wide, filled with something wild. And then it screamed. The sound was unlike anything the human had ever heard, metallic, raw, a fusion of pain and pure, unfiltered rage. It wasn't just a cry of suffering. It was something else. Something deeper. Something waking up. A pulse of energy blasted outward from the wolf's body, crackling like an electrical storm. The walls trembled. The lights flickered violently. The very air in the corridor seemed to distort, charged with something unnatural. The human barely had time to brace himself before the cyber wolf's body began to change. The plating along its back shifted, expanding, reshaping. Sparks erupted from the seams in its limbs. Its claws extended, no longer just metal but something sharper, something alive. The yellow glow in its eyes flared, shifting into something deeper, something dangerous. The human staggered back, his heart pounding. He had tried to save a wounded animal. But whatever this was, it wasn't just a cybernetic wolf anymore. And it wasn't running anymore. It was ready to fight. The cyber wolf stood there, its body transformed, its glowing eyes locked onto the advancing soldiers. The air around it crackled with energy, an unseen force pressing against the walls, making the metal groan. The human felt the weight of it in his chest like a storm rolling in, thick with electricity and something else, something powerful. The soldiers hesitated. Just for a second. But it was enough. The wolf moved first. It lunged, faster than before, its claws slicing through the first attacker's weapon like it was paper. The soldier barely had time to react before he was thrown backward, crashing into the wall with a sickening thud. The others opened fire. The corridor lit up with flashes of plasma and searing energy, but the wolf was already weaving between them, its movements fluid, precise. It wasn't just attacking, it was adapting, learning. The human ducked, shielding his head as the air filled with the scent of burning metal. His heart pounded. He had thought this creature was on the verge of death, barely holding on. But now, it was something else entirely. One of the soldiers barked an order into a comm, their voice laced with static. Containment failed, requesting immediate extraction. Containment. That word sent a chill through him. They weren't just here to kill the wolf. They were trying to control it. The cyber wolf spun toward the last standing soldier, its jaws parting just slightly. For the first time its voice came out smooth, clear. No more. Then it struck. A burst of energy exploded outward, sending the final soldier flying. His body slammed against the far wall, unconscious before he hit the ground. Silence fell. The human stood frozen, gripping the wall for support, his breath coming in short gasps. The clinic was destroyed, scorch marks and debris scattered everywhere. The cyber wolf stood in the center of it all, its form still pulsing with raw power. Then, slowly it turned to him. For the first time it looked aware. Not just of its surroundings but of itself. The human swallowed hard. What the hell are you? The wolf was silent for a long moment. Then its head tilted slightly, and its voice came softer this time, almost hesitant. I don't know. Something in his chest ached at that. Because it wasn't just a machine. It wasn't just some experiment. It was alive. And it had no idea who, or what, it was. The cyber wolf took a step forward, then suddenly stumbled, its limbs twitching. The glow in its eyes flickered. The energy around it wavered. It was still damaged. Still unstable. The human rushed forward, catching it before it collapsed completely. It felt heavier now, its metal plating strangely warm against his skin. "We need to get you out of here," he muttered. "Before they send more." The wolf blinked up at him, something unreadable in its gaze. Then it nodded. He exhaled sharply, adjusting his grip, and started moving. They had barely made it out of the corridor when the sound of distant alarms echoed through the station. More were coming. The human gritted his teeth. No turning back now. Then, just as he reached the emergency exit, just as he thought they might have a chance, the cyber wolf tensed. Its ears flicked back, its eyes narrowing. And then it whispered one word. "They're already here." The human barely had time to react before the world outside the station erupted into chaos. Something massive loomed beyond the docking bay, its dark shape blocking out the stars. Not just a ship. A war vessel. And it was waiting for them. The human's stomach dropped. This wasn't over. Not even close. And whatever the cyber wolf really was, someone out there was willing to start a war to take it back. The human's breath caught in his throat as he stared up at the massive war vessel looming over the docking bay. The sheer size of it made the station look like a child's toy in comparison. The dark metal exterior gleamed under the station's weak lighting, its edges sharp, predatory. It wasn't just here to retrieve the cyber wolf, it was here to make sure no one else got in the way. The cyber wolf stood beside him, its body still unstable, energy pulsing erratically beneath its plating. But its eyes were focused, locked onto the ship like it knew exactly what was coming next. The human swallowed hard. "Tell me you have a plan." The wolf's ears flicked back. "No. But I will not go back." That was enough. The station trembled as the war vessel activated its docking clamps, preparing to breach. Heavy, metallic thuds echoed through the air as a boarding crew was deployed. The human's mind raced. Running wasn't an option, not with the station in lockdown. Fighting an entire warship's crew? Not great odds. But they weren't dead yet. The cyber wolf turned to him, something intense behind its gaze. "You helped me." The human let out a rough breath, gripping the wrench still clutched in his hand. "Yeah. And I'd like to keep helping, but we're outnumbered by about 100 to 1. The wolf exhaled, a strange, static-laced sound, before lowering its head. "Then I will even the odds." Before the human could ask what that meant, the cyber wolf stepped forward, its form flickering as if struggling to hold itself together. But then something changed. The strange energy inside it surged outward, tendrils of blue lightning crawling over its limbs, stretching toward the floor. The metal beneath them vibrated, and suddenly the station lights flickered violently. Then they exploded. Not just the lights. The entire docking bay systems overloaded in a single pulse, sending sparks raining from the ceiling. The warship's docking clamps sputtered, struggling to maintain their grip. Control panels short-circuited. The air filled with the acrid scent of burning wires. The wolf was doing this. The human stumbled back as the cyber wolf's body pulsed with raw, untamed power, its plating shifting, reforming, adapting. It let out a low, guttural snarl, and then, with a force that rattled the walls, it lunged, straight at the war vessel's boarding hatch. The impact was catastrophic. The metal twisted like foil, alarms blaring as the ship's systems struggled against whatever the wolf had unleashed. Soldiers scrambled inside the breach, but the wolf moved like a force of nature, tearing through their ranks with inhuman speed. Sparks flew as its claws ripped through armor, disabling weapons before they could fire. The human barely had time to process before a voice crackled through the station's failing comms. "Security override engaged. Station lockdown disengaged." The cyber wolf was in control. The warship's engines roared to life, its systems scrambling to compensate for the unexpected attack. But the wolf wasn't finished. Its eyes burned bright as it turned its focus on the ship's core systems. The human realized what it was doing a second too late. "No, wait," he shouted. "If you take that thing down, you'll..." But the cyber wolf had already made its choice. A final surge of energy ripped through the air, so powerful it sent the human staggering. The warship's hull groaned under the strain, its internal systems shutting down one by one. Then, with a deep, shuddering sound, the massive vessel lost control. The clamps failed. The ship lurched backward, its engines sputtering as emergency protocols struggled to activate. And then the cyber wolf collapsed. The The human barely caught it before it hit the ground. Its body twitched, its circuits flickering weakly. It had poured everything it had into stopping that ship. And now it was barely holding on. The war vessel, now powerless, drifted away from the station, unable to maintain its position. Whatever the cyber wolf had done, it had crippled it. They wouldn't be coming back anytime soon. Silence settled over the ruined docking bay. The human's chest rose and fell rapidly as he looked down at the cyber wolf. Its eyes were still open but dimmer now. "You stupid stubborn," his voice cracked as he adjusted his grip, holding the wolf closer. "I didn't risk my life just for you to shut down on me now." The cyber wolf's head barely moved, but its gaze found his. "You should go. More will come." The human shook his head. "Not without you." A flicker of something almost like warmth, crossed the wolf's face. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then finally the wolf let out a small, static-filled breath. "Then we go together." It took everything the human had to get them off that station. They stole a ship, an old cargo freighter barely holding itself together, and disappeared into the void. The cyber wolf's body remained unstable for days, its system fighting to recover. But slowly it healed. Slowly, it learned to control its power, to reshape itself into something more than a weapon. And the human? He stayed. Because for all the danger, for all the unknowns, one thing had become clear. This wasn't just a cybernetic experiment. This wasn't just some lost machine. This was someone. And if the galaxy wanted to take the cyber wolf back, they were going to have to go through him first. Somewhere, far beyond the stars, the warship's wreckage drifted. And deep within its shattered remains, a signal pulsed in the darkness. Waiting. Watching. Listening. Because the ones who had created the cyber wolf? They weren't finished yet.